everyone. I am pleased to welcome Andrew Cartmel, a former script editor for the classical Doctor Who series. Mr. Cartmel is here to discuss his writing career and how he has adapted his writer's craft through the years. Thank you for visiting us today, Andrew. How are you today?
I'm great. So you're based in Arizona.
That's correct, Tempe, Arizona. We're a suburb of Phoenix.
Oh, lovely.
Yes, and right now the weather is actually this is the best time of the year to live in Arizona. I don't know if you've ever been here, but we're in the part of the area where it gets really hot during the summer's record heats. But from October through March, April, this is probably one of the best places on the planet to live. Thank you again for the opportunity to meet with you. It's this evening right now in London, right?
Yeah, it's very dark, but that's because it's at number one winter. Number two, we've changed the clock, so it's foolishly dark. It's just after 6 o'clock here.
What is the weather like there? Because right now here it's about 70.
Here it is not far off that, which is scary. I mean, we won't get into the whole climate change thing, but it should be pleasant weather, but it's not pleasant because of the context, if you see what I mean.
I understand. What were at least three people or events that influenced your decision to become a writer?
Well, ever since I was a kid, ever since I learned to read, I never wanted to do anything except write. So I suppose that question comes down to three writers who influenced me, and probably from the very early days, Ray Bradbury and Robert Heinlein were tremendous influences on me. And just to jump forward maybe 10 years or so, or 15 years, there's a fantastic American suspense and crime writer called John D. MacDonald, and I revere him, and I think I've tried to learn a lot of my craft from him just through the sheer range and quality of his writing. So I'd say that those are three people who've certainly influenced me. Actually, I can't stop at three. I also want to mention Thomas McGuane, who's a great American novelist, what we'd call a literary or mainstream novelist, who, thank heavens, is still with us and is still writing. And if anybody out there, if I can just get one person to read a Thomas McGuane book or even a Thomas McGuane short story as a result of this interview, I will consider my evening very well spent.
Mr. McGuane, what genre is he?
I'd say mainstream or literary fiction, as we'd say. He writes sort of National Book Award winning type or National Book Award nominee type books. He's a marvelous writer. I don't. Where does he live now? He lives somewhere, I think, in the Great Midwest.
The third writer you mentioned, I imagine he influenced The Vinyl Detective.
Yeah, The Vinyl Detective. Okay, so The Vinyl Detective was interesting. It's what we'd call cozy crime. And I would say that John D. MacDonald didn't write what we call cozy crime. I'm not sure I would say there was any single writer who influenced the entire series. It's more like on a book-for-book basis. There are influences. So, for instance, I wrote a book called Victory Disc. And at the time, I was reading a lot of crime fiction by a great golden age crime writer called Colonel Woolrich, best known these days from the movie Rear Window, a Hitchcock movie, which is based on a short story by him. Woolrich was the master of suspense and of putting his characters in hellish pressure cooker situations. And which is directly in the lineage of Poe and The Premature Burial and The Cask of Amontillado. It comes directly in that tradition down to the pulp fiction of the 1920s and 30s. And so when I wrote Victory Disc, I've been reading a lot of Woolrich, and it certainly came through in at least two sections of that novel, which feature very Woolrich type horrible things that happen to the protagonists. So that was one example. Another example is a novel I wrote called Low Action. And in that, I've been reading a lot of Agatha Christie, who I think is a really terrific writer. She doesn't need my support because she's probably the best-selling writer in the world. But I've been reading a lot of Christie, a lot of Poirot, and in particular, one called Peril at End House. Now, obviously, your books are murder mysteries, and my books tend to be those too. But in this case, I mean, there's many ways you can write a murder mystery, and one way is that you spend most of the novel setting up the possible guys who could be the killer, right? So you know that there's a killer, you don't know who it is, and you go from character to character. And what she did so brilliantly was they were all plausibly the culprit, and you just didn't know which one it was. So my objective in Low Action was to do that, to bring together a fascinating group of characters, and we don't know hopefully we don't guess who the bad guy is.
Right.
So these are specific influences. And then the latest novel, which is the sixth one in the series, which is called Attack and Decay. And that's not so much based on a single writer, but on a genre. It's what we would call Nordic noir, and you guys might call Scandi noir. I don't know. It's things like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or Jo Nesbo, or Henning Mankell, that
Okay.
kind of stuff.
My wife is very familiar with that particular genre. She enjoys it very much.
Great. Well, get her a copy of Attack and Decay. So that was sort of paid homage to that entire field of fiction.
I do agree with you on Bradbury. You mentioned Poe. I think Bradbury, I think short story Usher too, which brought that to
Isn't that set on Mars or something?
yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Sound of Thunder, the time travel story.
Oh, The Sound of Thunder is maybe my favorite story of all time. Just when I was a little kid, like, yeah, doesn't he step on a butterfly? Isn't that
exactly?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And what's fascinating is that was written decades before Chaos Theory and the Butterfly Wing, right? But it seems almost to be straight out of that metaphor. Yes, Sound of Thunder is one of my most revered stories of all time. And if you want to talk about the longer Bradbury stories, there's one called Frost and Fire, which is just amazing. It's the one where that people age incredibly quickly, like they age their entire lives last maybe a week. And then this guy, he ends up in a cave. And it turns out that some radiation that's causing this. And when he's in the cave, he's safe. This is a very incoherent and distant account of my memory of this story, but it's a short novel, actually, I think.
Bradbury's had such an influence, as you know, on sci-fi. I mean, Twilight Zone, Star Trek, you name it. He's had an influence on it.
He's a tremendously good writer. I'm just trying to think my other huge favorites by Bradbury. It's mostly the short stories, except, of course, he wrote the classic science fiction novel Fahrenheit 451, which is still such a potent polemic, I would say.
I would agree, especially when we were talking before, some political circles are advocating the equivalent of book burnings or censorship. So it's very, like you said, it is very poignant today. Please explain at least two ways your experience with Doctor Who influenced your later career as a novelist, screenwriter, graphic novel composer, and playwright.
Oh, yes, I can answer that one with a very specific example. So when I was working on Doctor Who, I was the script editor, which was I ran the writing team. So I was like a showrunner in terms of my authority over the writing area. Was not involved in casting or hiring directors or any of that. Mm-hmm. But in the area of dealing with writers, I had considerable autonomy. And I was extremely good at my job. I know this sounds immodest. But one of the aspects of the job, which is very important, is when people have written too much, telling them to cut, to reduce or, do this, don't do that. Well, we were working on a story called Battlefield, which was written by my friend Ben Aronovich, who's one of the best writers I ever had on that show. And there came a point where he needed to write a speech, which was basically an anti-nuke speech. Mm-hmm. And he didn't want to do it, not because he didn't agree with that. He totally agreed with that philosophy, but he'd grown up in a British communist household, CND, which is Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So he had imbibed this rhetoric all through his life as a kid, and he was just sick of it. He just couldn't convincingly come up with something with any passion. So he handed it to me, and I wrote this long speech for the Doctor, an anti-nuke speech, and I was incredibly proud of it. And I meant every word of it. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's in Ben's script. So Ben read it, and Ben said, "Oh, it's a great speech, but it's way too long." I said, "Nonsense, it's not too long." The producer read it, and he said, "Oh, it's a lovely speech, darling, but it's a bit long." And I said, "It's not too long." And the director read it, and he said, "A great speech, but isn't it a bit long?" I said, "No." So they did the speech. I think Sylvester probably said it was too long too, but Sylvester did it. And I saw the footage, and it was way too long. It was so too long. And we managed to save it by cutting the film, cutting the videotape, by cutting away and cutting back and losing bits of it. The reason I'm talking about that is you're asking about lessons I learned from Doctor Who. Mm-hmm. I learned to be as ruthless with my own material as with other people's material. And that was the moment that I learned that. I just learned that you have to turn a cold eye on yourself. And more importantly than that, I learned that it's not easy to be objective about your own material. And you can think it's great when it's not great. And so that was the most valuable. There were many, myriad valuable lessons I got working on Doctor Who and working with those great writers and learning about scripts. But that's the one that comes to mind, and it's certainly one of the most important.
That's the scene where Sylvester McCoy is talking to Jean Marsh.
Yeah, he says something like nuclear weapons have a graveyard stench or something like that. Yeah. I remember. That was Ben's line, by the way. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, I remember that episode. I do know what you're saying, though, because when I've written and I think, oh, this is the best thing since sliced bread. And then my editor looks at it, it's like, oops, you never see it sometimes, like you said.
But the difficult thing, David, is that sometimes they are wrong and you are right. And it's knowing that difference. Like sometimes people will say that's not good and you'll believe it is good and they'll be right, but sometimes they will be wrong. So
Right.
you have to be ruthless with your own work, but you also have to know when to make a stand. And the only way really to do that is through experience. And I think that's what we do gain. I do have a rule of thumb for that, which I think is useful for people. When your editors and so on are asking for changes in your work, or your friends are criticizing your work, there are two occasions when you should always go with their suggestions, even though it might break your heart to do it. Number one is if somebody suggests something and you'd sort of kind of had that at the back of your mind, you
Mm-hmm.
sort of thought that, but you didn't go down that route. But when they say it, then when they say it, you got to go with it. The other time is if two other people independently give you the same note, like they don't know anything about each other, but they both give you the same note, even if you hate it, it's almost certain to be right, no matter how much it breaks your heart to make the cut or make the change. So those are the two occasions when you've really got to be take very seriously what people are asking you to change, even if you don't want to.
I agree. Like you've been there, experienced that, understood. A couple of follow-ups on Doctor Who, if I may. The show was making a renaissance during your time as the script editor and with Sylvester McCoy as the Doctor, and then the BBC still canceled it.
Bummer.
Yeah. And when the program was coming back, you had very good shows: Remembrance of the Daleks, Greatest Show in the Galaxy, Curse of Fenric, Ghostlight.
Survival, Ghostlight. I know.
Yeah. And also Dragonfire, which was also an Ian Briggs.
Thank you. Yeah, Briggs is a great writer.
What would have happened had the show continued?
Well, what would have happened? The first thing that would have happened is that the companion would have changed, not because Sophie wasn't great. She was great. And as Ace, she provided the template for the companions when the show came back. I mean, there's a direct lineage between Ace and Rose. And we, especially the story Survival, is just like a ski jump into the Russell T Davies era, I would say. So Sophie was great, and Ace was an absolutely pivotal and seminal character. But in the next season, we would have changed the companion because you knew we would have kept Sylvester on for another season, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But so you never change the companion and the Doctor at the same time. You always want that. At least that was John Nathan Turner, the producer's theory. So you always want some kind of continuity. So you haven't changed everything, which is very sensible. Mm-hmm. So no matter how great Sophie was, at some point in the near future, she would have gone on to other things, and we would have had a new companion, and we would continue with the Doctor for a while. And then at some point, Sylvester would have left, and we would have kept that companion and brought in a new Doctor. So that was just very broad strokes. That's where we would have gone.
Do you think he gets a fair due for his performance?
I'm amazed sometimes because I do conventions, and you get like a 15-year-old kid coming up and saying Sylvester's my favorite Doctor, which is extraordinary. I mean, you would think at best it would be David Tennant. There'd have to be this is decades before they were born, right?
Right.
So there are a lot of things wrong with the shows that we did, but they're wrong in terms of production values. Sometimes the directors didn't get it, or they were insensitive, or they just didn't get the script, or they didn't get the script on the screen. But the scripts were really good, with no false sense of modesty. The actors were really great. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we had dreadful costumes or a special effect that didn't work, or some CGI, which is like the well, you know what CGI is. It's the computer generated background. In those days, it would have been CSI, color section overlay, CSO, sorry. But all those technical things can go wrong. And Doctor Who, they frequently did, because we never had enough time or enough money, because in those days, the show was very unloved. So it was very marginalized. But having said all that, we did some great work under very difficult conditions. And certainly we were heading in the right direction, and our heart was in the right place. The most interesting thing about that was that Doctor Who had been run into the ground, and it was absolutely tanking when I joined the show. And it was tanking because of all the decisions that the producer John Nathan Turner had made, and it had gone into decline. But the thing is, we turned it around, and it was getting way better because John Nathan Turner hired us. He made all these wrong decisions, but he also made all these right decisions, because he hired me as a script editor. He hired Sylvester, he hired Sophie, and he let us go for it. So he was a very interesting man, complex man. And As I say, I think he ran the show into the ground, but then he was in the process of turning the show into a great classic show. And that was when they pulled the plug. They didn't pull the plug at the lowest point. They pulled the plug at a high point, which just makes it wouldn't make sense at any point because Doctor Who was always an international money spinner. So even if you just wanted to look at it purely from a monetary point of view, canceling it was madness. But we were doing great work. I mean, how could somebody... There are things wrong with survival, but they're all to do with the costumes for the cheetah people and some of the effects. The writing of that story is amazing, and the acting, like what is being got at there, it's just extraordinary. How anybody with a soul could watch that show and not be moved by it. Or Ghostlight, which is this extraordinary kind of Lewis Carroll, strange Victorian. Is it a ghost story or is it about aliens? People can be baffled by Ghostlight, but I don't think anybody's ever been bored by it or ever thought that there's anything except an extraordinary piece. You know, it goes on. The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, Remembrance of the Daleks. How you could watch a series like that and just cancel it is utterly reprehensible.
Last question on Who. As a script editor, and this goes to some of the questions I asked about the best and the heartbreak writing. What was the best script you had fun script editing, and what was the one that was probably the most challenging?
Okay, we'll get rid of the most challenging one first. When I came on the show, I inherited a script that I couldn't change. It was Pip and Jane Baker. It was called Dark Matter, I believe, when I first got it, and then it became Time and the Rani. And I didn't like it. I didn't think it worked. It was certainly wrong for the way we were going. It was very kind of the way the show used to be, or even beyond that. It was very old-fashioned, and it didn't work. But I couldn't change it because the writers would not cooperate with me, and they had no desire to change it. So I disavow that script. And so that was my worst moment. Like, if you love that, and people do love that script, I will take no credit for it, but I will also take no blame for it because I wasn't allowed to operate as a proper script editor on that. And my big mistake was not taking my name off that because I didn't want anybody to feel that represented my intentions of the show. Love it or hate it, Time and the Rani is not the way I wanted the show to be. So that was my worst experience on it. My best experience was Remembrance of the Daleks, because Ben Aronovich sent in a spec script called Nightfall, spelled with a K, like chestnut.
Oh, okay.
And it was nothing to do with Remembrance of the Daleks. It was completely different. And it wasn't even a workable Doctor Who script, but it had flashes of genius, and it showed that he could write, and he could write Doctor Who. And I knew that within the first page, halfway down the first page, I knew that this guy was something special. And I was right. And we had I'm getting goosebumps now thinking about what great fun we had working on Remembrance of the Daleks. I don't think it's just the best Doctor Who that I worked on. I think it's probably the greatest Doctor Who story ever. I mean, you can find faults with it. Again, they're mostly to do with things like budget and design limitations, but it's a stunningly well-written script, and I just think it's brilliant. And it's got the line "unlimited rice pudding" in it. What could be better than that? Oh yes. Any other scripts that you'd like to comment on before? Well, look, it's like choosing your favorite child. As soon as I say, right, Remembrance of the Daleks does always tend to win out. It's got a slight edge, but then I think I mentioned how much I love Survival. I've mentioned how much I love Ghostlight. There are wonderful things in Stephen's scripts, but most especially in The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, a title which I don't like at all, which was imposed on us by John Nathan Turner. But under that title, Alan Waring was the best director we ever had, and he did a great job, not just on Survival, but on The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. It was a case of a good writer getting a good director, so that was wonderful. Ian Briggs, I think, I'm glad you mentioned Dragonfire, because Dragonfire was an amazingly good script, which had a lot of really... John Asbridge, who did the design, did some amazing designs, which were really badly lit. I mean, Ian wrote a great script, which is badly directed by Chris Clough. And John Asbridge designed great sets, which were badly lit by whoever did the lighting. So there was great stuff in there, which was not well served. But then you have Curse of Fenric, where, again, it's an Ian Briggs script, and I think it was well served. I think Nick Mallett was a very sensitive and intelligent director, and he did a very good job on that. But I have to add the caveat, I'm talking about the director's cut, the expanded cut, right? Because those scripts were way too long, and they had to cut them enormously to make them fit. And the cut down versions just don't work. The short form version of Fenric in the way that it went out, I watched it and I just despaired. It just did not work. But when I saw the expanded cut, it did work. There are still some problems with it, like the hemovore, especially the chief hemovore. Like
Right.
mask doesn't work, his mouth flops. There's things wrong with it. There's other bits and pieces that just don't work, but they're all to do with execution. They're to do with time and money. They're not to do with the artistic intent or the creative power of the people involved. So Curse of Fenric's another great one. I don't want to single out any for not praising them. As soon as I stop talking, I'll think about other ones I should have praised. I mean,
Right.
stories like The Happiness Patrol, it's got the basics. I think of all the stories we did, the basic central concept of The Happiness Patrol is the strongest. It's as simple as a parable. It's a planet where it's a crime to be unhappy. It's amazing. And I miss Graham Curry, the writer of that great. I think he was a genius.
Excellent. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about your experience on Doctor Who before I know you've probably been asked
It sounds self-serving to tell people to read my memoir, Script Doctor. But as I say, if you've got a friend who's got a copy, just borrow it from a friend. I'm not sure. Obviously, I'd love it if you bought it and I got the royalties. But that's not my primary objective here. My primary objective is if you're interested in that era of Who, the Sylvester McCoy era, this will bring it to life for you because it was written by somebody who was there and kept notes, which almost never happens. And I'm very, very proud. It was the first book I wrote that I was genuinely proud of because it's a really good book because it's like a time capsule. It's like a wormhole where you can go and actually see people making that show and hear what they said at the time. So the other thing I want to add to my comments is if you read that book, I think it will bring that period of the show to life for you.
Number 3, based on your later works like The Vinyl Detective, and I know you wrote for Mr. Forgive me if I mispronounce it, Aronovich, the River of London graphic novels.
So Ben Aronovich, as I mentioned earlier, I discovered him when I was doing Doctor Who. He was great. He was an aspiring TV writer, and I had the great good fortune to hire him, and he wrote some of the best Doctor Who ever. And then years later, he wrote a very successful series of novels called the Rivers of London novels, which your listeners and viewers should rush out and buy because they're great. They're about the branch of the Metropolitan Police that deals with the supernatural. So they're fabulous. Now, they were so successful that a publisher wanted to do spin-off comics, graphic novels. And then Ben took me on board as his writing partner for those because he wanted another mind. He needed... Because of time pressures, he needed somebody else to help him, but also it's very healthy to have another brain involved when you're doing a project like that.
So based on your later experience, would you say you're more, forgive me, noir, mystery, thriller genre than science fiction? Do you think that's more?
I'm much more a crime writer than a science fiction or fantasy writer, which is not to say I don't love that stuff. I'm currently, for the first time, reading George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones books, the Song of Ice and Fire. Having seen the TV series and loved it, I finally got around to starting to read the books, and I'm amazed at how good they are, and I'm so engrossed in them. So although I'd say I'm much more a crime and suspense fiction kind of guy, that doesn't mean I still don't love science fiction and fantasy, which were my first loves when I was a reader.
You said you liked the Game of Thrones series. I did too. Did you like the last season?
Well, it's very funny. As you know, I had lunch with an old friend today.
Right.
We were talking about Game of Thrones, and I said, I haven't seen the last season yet. And he said, don't see it. And a lot of people have told me that they don't like the last season, right? And which is heartbreaking because I love that show so much. But the last season was always going to be problematical because he hasn't written the last 2 books yet, has he?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, they went if you haven't seen it, I would see it because you have to see how it ends, obviously.
I do need to see how it ends, and people have very effectively lowered my expectations of it because so many people have said that. My friend, it was Ben Aronovich, says that the novels he feels decline. He feels that they kind of get big and baggy and off the point. And I'm really hoping that doesn't happen because I'm loving the book so much. I mean, I can't, it's like, you know, when you're a kid and you get a book and you just love it and you can't stop reading it and you have that incredible passion and commitment to it and you're lost in that world. When you grow up, that doesn't happen too often, but it's happening with these books. And I've just finished Game of Thrones, and I'm now reading Clash of Kings, the second one. And I just think he's such a great writer. And I do have, it sounds like you know his stuff. Do you know the books?
Not directly. No, not directly. I have not read those yet. I've pretty much watched the series. I just watched the House of Dragon series. I know, with Matt
Prequel,
Smith.
yeah.
Yeah, Matt Smith is a really good actor. He really has a lot of range, and that's shown in that series. Let's continue. Let's continue.
Yeah,
That's
sorry. You
no,
carry
no,
on.
no. I digress. I digress too. Not a problem. I love it. So I think you already answered this, but if you want to expand, what was your major inspiration for creating the Final Detective series? I think you expand on that on.
All I've always wanted to do is write books. And I've written, working on Doctor Who gave me the opportunity to write Doctor Who novels, but they were Doctor Who novels. They weren't totally my own baby. And I've tried, uh, I had written some novels that were my own stuff. They'd never quite worked. And I was talking to Ben Aronovich, who, as I mentioned, has had a very successful series of novels. And I said, Ben, what is the trick? And he said, the trick is to write about what you genuinely love rather than trying to write what you think would be a successful novel. I mean, that's quite an interesting distinction. Don't try and second guess the marketplace. One of the things I really love is records, vinyl, hi-fi, music, obviously, record collecting. But I have to make it quite clear that collecting can be a dead end and a spiritual dead end. The reason I'm collecting records of my hero is to listen to them, and the ultimate end is to listen to music and have it sound great, which is why we're both into vinyl, me and my hero. So I loved record collecting, vinyl, and I loved crime fiction. So I thought, well, if I combine those, and it worked, because the point is, if you write about something that you really love and care about, it carries through, it shows in the writing. And although the person reading it may not give a damn about records or record collecting, what they do get is that there's something genuine here. And also, they're not really about the records, are they? They're about the crime, they're about the murder mystery, they're about the people. And the whole record thing, the whole vinyl thing is just a hook to hang that on. But, say that you've got a hero who is an expert in orchids or rare coins or stamps or chess or whatever their gimmick is, it just establishes a world in which the story takes place. And preferably it's a world that is slightly exotic and interesting to the reader, and above all is convincing to the reader, because the reader wants to be transported from their everyday life into an illusion, a sustained illusion that entertains them. And that's the illusion here. It's the bubble that I blow. It's the image that I project. And I think that's why it's important that it's something that you actually do know and care about, because that makes it easy to write about. I mean, I could have written about a detective who's an expert cheesemaker, but I would have, and it's, and I like cheese, but I would have had to do a hell of a lot of research for that, and I wouldn't have known anything about it. So this is low hanging fruit, and as I say, written with a genuine passion.
And you're on your sixth novel. Do you know how many you plan to? Do you already have outlined future works?
I've got at least 3 or 4 worked out, and I just want to keep writing it. I mentioned John D. MacDonald earlier as a writing hero of mine. He wrote something like 70 novels. Most of them were standalone one-offs, but he had a series character called Travis McGee, who was very successful, sold millions and millions. And I think there were 21 Travis McGee novels, and they just got better. I've read some series. There's nothing I like better than discovering a new series that I adore. And I've had some disappointments. Like you keep reading, and then they just aren't. They decline, or there's some bum novels. There were never any bum Travis McGee novels, and he just improved. He kept setting himself new challenges, and the books were never boringly formulaic. I heard 2 British crime novelists having a talk on the radio, and one of them said something like, nobody's 15th novel in a series is the best novel. And they both laughed. And I thought, well, you know what? You're wrong. The 15th novel should be the best in the series, and the 16th should be better than that. And with some writers, that is the case, and that is what we aspire to. So in answer to your question about how many novels I want to write, dozens would be the answer. And just as long as I keep the standard up, and that's within my gift. As long as I work hard enough and stay sharp enough and don't get stale. I mean, the trouble is people get fed up with the characters. I mean, Conan Doyle got fed up with Sherlock Holmes and killed him off. And Sherlock, but you can sort of see that, because Sherlock Holmes is a brilliant character, but he's a limited character. So what you need, and it's a very limited, airless world, because it's him and Watson really isn't a character. He's not much of a character, is he? I mean, not compared to Holmes. So what you need quite a rich world with quite a diversity, or quite a variety of characters. So for instance, the Travis McGee novels, he had a foil, a sidekick called Meyer, who's much more interesting than Watson. Like, he's a really interesting character in his own right, and novels could be got out of Meyer and his situations. And there's a magnificent writer called Patrick O'Brien who writes novels about the maritime component of the Napoleonic Wars. He's writing about the wars at sea in Napoleonic times, and they're fabulous novels. And the thing about them is he very carefully constructed it so that they got two main characters who are equals. You've got Jack Aubrey, who's the captain of the ship, he's a great character. But then you got Stephen Maturin, who's the ship's surgeon. And one guy is sort of like a heroic buccaneering hero, the sort of guy to lead his men into battle. And the other one, the surgeon, is a spy. So they're they're completely different characters. Their nature's very different, but they're great friends. And they both open up into worlds of subsidiary characters. And that series went on for, I think, 20 odd books. And they were brilliant because the basic setup was rich enough to keep sustaining it. Whereas you could see that Sherlock Holmes could get a bit repetitive. He never had any very good secondary characters. Even Moriarty, I don't think was that great. I'm not a Holmes expert, but I'm just saying how it is that a great writer can create a great character and then grow bored with them. And the trick is not to, because you must never let your reader down. As I say, I've had that experience with some books. And if you've read a book in a series you've been reading, and you've read dozens of books, and you read one that's a dud, you really do feel betrayed, and you never quite have the same feeling about the series again. So that's something I never want to do to my readers.
Totally understand. Segueing to you have a play, Glacier Lake. What inspired you to create the play?
Well, I've always been interested in I'm trying to think what got me into stage plays. Probably what got me into stage plays was I would have seen the movie of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is by Edward Albee, which is a great movie. I would have seen it on TV. And then at some point I would have read the play. And that's really probably how I began to fall in love with theater and stage plays. And it was through reading plays in book form that really got me into it. Then when I was doing my postgrad at university, I had the chance to put on a play, which I wrote and directed. And I'm not sure I'll ever direct a play again, because that's very hard work. And also it really helps, as I said earlier, to have a second mind involved in you. If you've written a play, what you really want is to get somebody really good to direct it, because they'll bring so much to it that you can't, because you know the story and the world really well, but you only know what you know. Somebody else will have a new take on it. So I'm not hot on directing my plays again, but I do love writing them. And since then, I've had a number of plays on in what we call the Fringe, which is sort of the London equivalent of off-Broadway, right? So little theaters.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think how many I've had on. 1, 2, 3, 4, probably about 5 productions of 4 different plays. And I can't tell you how much I love doing stage plays. And anybody out there who's an aspiring writer should consider doing a stage play, because say that you want to write a novel, good luck to you. It's a very tough endeavor, but it's also a very lonely endeavor. Whereas plays are inherently social activities. They were interviewing Tom Stoppard, who's one of the great playwrights of this century and the last. And he said he's written novels and he's written plays, but playwrights have much better social lives, and it's very true. But the other crucial thing about it is, compared to, say, writing a TV script or a movie script, what you can actually do with a stage play is you can invite a bunch of out-of-work actors around to your house, feed them spaghetti, and ask them to read your play around the table. And the distance between having your play read around the table by a bunch of good actors and an actual full-scale production is not that big a difference, because you're actually hearing your words read by real actors, talented people. They're bringing it to life. Obviously, it's not a proper production. They're not actually acting because they've got the scripts in front of them, so they're reading. They haven't got the costumes on. Nobody's directed. There's no lighting. But as I say, the distance between the two experiences is not that huge. It's not like reading a movie script and like doing the movie, which is a gigantic distance because it's a completely different beast. You're actually getting a genuine flavor of what your play will be like just through that. And it will be the most thrilling experience of your life. And actors often are out of work, God bless them, and they are more than willing if you can cook them a nice meal. And invite them around. And if your play is good, if you can write speakable dialogue, Somerset Maugham once said, if you can write dialogue, you're halfway to being a playwright. Really. I mean, there are other things involved, but just learn to write sound that is naturalistic, or at least sounds naturalistic, and that your actors can speak, and that is revelatory of character. They will be very happy to read your play, and you'll be very happy to hear it. And the only other piece of advice is, by all means, give your actors lots of wine to drink, but not until after they've read the play.
From your life experience, do you prefer the playwriting as opposed to the novel writing, or even the screenwriting?
No, I love them both. I would say they're my two favorites, and I've done a lot of stuff. I've written TV scripts, I've written audio scripts, I've written comics, graphic novels. But of all those, and they've all have their virtues, and I've loved doing them all and in different ways. But my two favorites are playwriting and novel writing, which are polar opposites, because, as I say, one is a totally solitary and internal activity, which is the novel writing, of course. And then you have the much more open and outward and group activity of the playwriting. So I love them both equally in very different ways. And each of them has their own unique frustrations and virtues. So the great thing about writing your novel is you completely have the ability to create that world, and you create it exactly the way you want it to. It's the closest thing to actually having like a mind linked to getting something from your mind directly into somebody else's mind by putting it into words, your exact words. You write them, they read them. Now sometimes people will misread what you said, or they'll visualize it very differently, but it's the closest thing you can get to direct telepathy as a storyteller. So that's why novels are great. But all the great things about plays are sort of opposite to that, because actors will take something you've written and they'll do it in a completely different way, and it'll be great. I mean, not always, but sometimes it'll be great. And you are writing something that isn't complete, really, until the actors bring it to life. So you're starting a process that requires other people to finish it with it. And there's a great joy in collaboration. I often think when I'm writing plays, I know a lot of actors now as a result of having done a lot of plays, and I know a lot of really good actors. And sometimes I write parts specifically for a certain actor. And I always think it's like Duke Ellington, who was the greatest jazz composer and band leader of his time, because he would write music and he would know who he expected to play the tenor sax solo and the trumpet solo and the violin. So he was writing for those sounds were for specific musicians. Those bits of the music were for specific musicians. So it's a bit like that when I'm writing the parts in my plays for specific actors, and it is wonderful to hear them do it. It's really the greatest joy.
Excellent. And your last part of your answer, where you talk about process, leads right to the next question. And I know this might be different depending on what genre it is, but please explain, in your opinion, the writing process for you personally. Do you start with an outline, like, for example, then proceed to draft test? Do you brainstorm thoughts first and proceed from there? How many draft revisions do you go through, and how long does the process take? Does it take like a year?
It can take more than a year, but it also can happen very quickly. I recently discovered that J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls, which is a great play. I don't know, it's very famous, and if you haven't seen it or read it, do so, because it's amazing. It's also kind of supernatural, which is quite cool. He wrote it in a week. He wrote it in a week. It's, and it's a great play. And sometimes something seizes you and you will write it very quickly. So, but in answer to your question about I think outlines can be very useful, especially when you're starting out. And I used to use outlines quite a lot, but I don't use them so much now. And I think that's because I've sort of internalized the process more. Now that when I sit down to write, on some level, on some subconscious level, I've been working that stuff through. But certainly if I get stuck, I will do that. And what I'll do is I'll just write on random pieces of paper, and I won't even know what order the various scenes are going in. But I do that much less now. Now I sort of open the file on my computer. If I'm writing a novel, it's in Microsoft Word. If I'm writing a play, it's in something called Final Draft, which is a software for writing screenplays and plays. Oh. It's going to end up in that kind of format anyway. So I try not to do too much stuff writing in pen on paper, because I'm going to have the extra work of transferring it. But I certainly will do that. Like if I'm away from base, if I'm away from my computer, I'll certainly write in a notebook if inspiration seizes me. And sometimes, especially as I say, in the past, it used to be part of the process, writing on paper jotting down notes, looking at stuff. And I still would advise writers to do that. Something that I don't do anymore, but I used to find tremendously useful is you take a piece of foolscap, turn it on its side, so it's what we call landscape instead of portrait, right? So you're holding it so that it's vertical. Then draw a grid across it of, say, 12 squares, and then just work out your story and put bits of the story in the squares. And that what you started to do there is you've not only worked out the sequence of your story, you're beginning to work out what ratio, if you've got the Battle of Waterloo somewhere in your novel, how much of the novel is the Battle of Waterloo going to take up? Is it going to be 90%? So just putting stuff in squares like that is a very primitive exercise, but it begins to help you structure and pace your novel, which is where inexperienced writers really come unstuck. When I was teaching screenwriting, which is what I used to do a lot, I used to tell people, do what I call a page budget. Like your screenplay is going to be no more than 120 pages, right? Go through you've written an outline, which is usually like 2 pages, say, and just go through the outline and work out how many pages of the script you're going to dedicate to each section. So you break it up into chunks, your story, and figure out whether this is like a 2-page scene or a 20-page scene. And they might get it wrong, but it would start the students thinking about that. And it was crucial because otherwise you might write 70 pages and find that you've only just begun your story, right? You've got 30 pages to tell most of your story in, and that ain't going to work. So it stops you wasting time. So all these things are very useful, especially when you're starting out. But I do think as you go along, one might find that one internalizes them more.
Just as a quick follow-up, and I know it's probably happened to you, I know it's happened to me, when you have an idea and say you're walking down the street and you don't have a notebook with you and you're like, I got to make it. What is it like for you when you have an idea? It's like, I hope I make it home so I don't forget it, or something.
Well, that's a tough one because there are times when I have thought, oh, I'll write that down in a minute, and then it's gone. But there's a guy called Darren Brown who's a British illusionist, and one of the things that he does, like he does memory tricks, and one of the ways he does that is he when he's walking to work, he will use each landmark on the way to work and associate it with something in his head. It's a bit like this thing about the memory palace, which which was something that I believe the ancient Greeks did, but I'm familiar with it from a Hannibal Lecter novel.
Okay.
But it's the whole idea is that you associate things with other things, and that hopefully that will help you remember them. I find that I can't even remember a shopping list that way. I've tried, but it's one of the tricks. The more links you can form, the more you can connect an idea with other ideas would be really useful. And also sometimes just think about, if you could just, when I first began to write, and I followed this advice about creating characters where you'd write a short biography of them. And that may work brilliantly for some writers. For me, it did the opposite of work. It just killed the characters dead. What I found that was really useful is if I could just imagine that character just saying something about themselves, just, something preferably with a bit of attitude. If I could just capture something of their character in something they said. So I just try and write a scrap of dialogue by that character that reveals something about their nature. And I find that very useful. So I often think about having a character say something. And indeed, if I'm writing notes sometimes you want to write, you've got a lot to summarize, right? So if you're putting down notes for a novel, it would take almost as long to write the novel, to write a detailed outline, right? It would take forever. So I would just want to write a quick summary of it, but I don't want that summary to kill the idea dead for me, which it used to do. So I would just I'd have my character. In the case of Vinyl Detective, I'd have write some dialogue by the Vinyl Detective saying, okay, so this is what happened to me. And then he'd give a quick summary of the novel. And now, I know it sounds nuts, but to me, that's much more useful than just putting it down baldly as the writer about from a godlike point of view, this is the novel I'm going to write, this is what's going to happen. That sort of kind of kills it dead for me in a way that it doesn't kill it dead if I put it in the voice of the character. It's all a matter of helping you get into that mood for the writing. And that's something that works for me. Other writers will have other things that work for them.
So that leads to the next couple of questions. What has been the easiest work for you to write?
Well, what happens is you have moments. So I wanted to write a stage thriller, right? A classic stage thriller set in the 1930s. So sort of like an Agatha Christie kind of murder mystery type thing. And I didn't have an idea for it. I wanted it to be full of gruesome twists and murders and gothic 1920s detective golden age detective stories are. But I had no idea what the basic story was. And then suddenly I thought of Misery by Stephen King. And I thought, what if it's about a writer and the writer's fans, and the tension between, and that I remember where I was standing in my kitchen when it came to me, and I just sort of praised the Lord, because that was all I needed, because I knew then I could write the play, and I did write the play. But you just needed that breakthrough moment, if you see what I mean. When you say it's easy, it's not necessarily a case of it being easy to write the whole thing, but just those road to Damascus insights are what suddenly make it tremendously easy. And there was another play I wanted to write, and it was about American politics. And there was all kinds of structural, procedural problems with it, where the characters I couldn't bring the characters together, because in the normal course of things, these characters would not meet. It was a legal story, right? So you wouldn't have the judges, and you wouldn't have all these people in the same room. And I worked out a way of getting them in the same room, and I was just so happy. And the reason I'm being cagey is because I'd rather you saw the play than had me give a kind of half-assed description of it, spoiler-laden description of it.
What are the names of those last two plays that you just mentioned?
Okay, so the play that was inspired by
Misery,
the notion of writer and the writer's fans is called Murder Us. And the play that is the one that I was looking for, a situation that would allow these characters to interact, is called Supreme Doubt.
Very good. And that leads to number 9. What was the most difficult work for you to write?
My most recent novel, which was because it was the first novel in a new series. My publisher wanted to do a new series in parallel with a vinyl detective novel. So I came up with a character she's not called, but she is the paperback sleuth. So in the same way that the vinyl detective is murder mysteries and suspense stories arising out of the world of collecting records, she collects vintage paperback books. And that, again, because it's something that I'm nuts about and that I have a great love for and knowledge of. And it took quite a long way to find the way into that, because there's a whole new series. So I knew it had to be different. So the vinyl detective is what we call a first-person narrative. He says, I did this, I do. It's all through his eyes. It's all first person. So I immediately wanted it to be different from that. So I made the main protagonist a woman, not a man. And I tell it what we call the close third person, which is, instead of saying I did this or I did that, it's she did this and she did that, but it's slightly in her head. So it'd be like Cordelia thought he was a complete idiot. Nonetheless, she forced herself to smile at him. So you see, you're describing the action from outside, but with insights to what's inside her head all the time. And so it took quite a long time to find that character. And I actually sort of took a couple of attempts at it. That was the most difficult, because it was the creation of a new series. And I'm very happy now with where I am with it. But it took quite a lot of experimentation and exploration to get there.
And that leaves, what has probably been your most proud achievement in writing?
I'm very pleased with the most recent vinyl detective novel, which is Attack and Decay. I think I really got so much right with that. But I'm also very proud and pleased with my plays, because I feel that I'm beginning to fire on all cylinders there too. So if I had to choose one play, I'd probably choose the play As Real as Anything. But it's not just the play that I wrote, it was how well it was acted and directed. So again, that's a group effort.
Tell us a little bit about that play. What is the plot of that play? Yeah,
it's about whether you can be in love with somebody and you're just in love with an illusion. So what it's actually about is it's 4 characters, 2 men, 2 women, 2 couples, 2 married couples. Mm-hmm. And one married couple is a producer of stage plays and her husband is a director of stage plays. And the other married couple is an actress and her husband is a writer. And the setup is that they're going to get together and do a revival of a play that was very successful for them in the past. But the thing is, the director and the actress had this fiery, burning affair when they put on the play the first time. Now, they're now married to other people, so obviously that could be problematic.
Right.
But the trouble is, the director isn't really in love with the actress, and the actress isn't really in love with the director, but it's when she plays this particular character that it happens. Like, all bets are off. Like, he can't resist her. Not that he can't resist her. He can't resist her when she's this character, when she becomes the woman in the play. So he's in love with somebody who doesn't even exist. And she's in love with him. So that was the notion behind the play. And what was interesting is when I started doing the play, the actor said, oh, yeah, that happens all the time because like you're doing a play and you're completely in love with this other actor in the play. Then when the play ends, you just think, what was that about? Like it was only when they were in that imaginary world that was happening. And this so totally, I didn't realize that this is totally a thing, but it really is. And the implications of that, like, because the reason it's called as real as anything, because while it's happening, it's as real as anything, but it can burst like a soap bubble. So that's it was about exploring that. And I think I had a great play because it was done really brilliantly. It was brilliantly directed by Jenny Eastop and acted by Rosie Edwards, Kelsey Short, Alistair Shanks, and Jamie Hutchins. Thank you all, guys.
Excellent. Probably what would you say is your most heartbreaking writing experience?
Probably the same play, because the play was great, but it lost a load of money. We took a 90% loss on it. So it wasn't heartbreaking creatively, but it was so frustrating, that play. Well, if I can also mention the earlier play, Glacier Lake. Please. The thing is, that play was, again, I thought it came off really well. But that play was what we call a polemic. It had a really important social message about climate change. And I managed to package that message, not in some like shouty diatribe, but in a very kind of cunningly packaged in a compelling thriller. And I thought that play would change the world. I thought this would get the message out there and it'll change hearts and minds. But instead of making a splash, it hardly made a ripple. So that, I suppose I'd say that was the most heartbreaking thing, because you put these plays out there and they're really good productions. They're immaculate, but only a few people come and see them. And that's the nature of putting on a play by an unknown play by an unknown playwright without a star in it. It's very difficult to light. It's very difficult to get a fire burning when you've got wet twigs. And that's sort of what you're starting with when you've got all those things, that you haven't got a star and you haven't got a famous vehicle. It's very difficult to get people in. And I'm still working on that. And we will eventually, the fire will light. But while the fire isn't lighting, it is a bit heartbreaking.
I understand. So what are the names of, or any future projects you want to highlight that you're working on?
Well, most importantly is the first paperback sleuth novel, which is called Death in Fine Condition. So that should be coming out next year. And I hope people will take a look at that. But if they want to look at what is already in existence, I would say please look at The Vinyl Detective and check out Attack and Decay, because it's the most recent novel. It's the one I'm most proud of. If you're into Doctor Who and you've been kind enough to listen to all this, which has been very Doctor Who related, do check out my book Script Doctor, which is my memoir about working on Doctor Who, because I was keeping diaries at the time, and it's really will bring that era back to life very strikingly for you. You don't have to buy a copy. If you can borrow it from your library, please do, but do have a read of it.
Last question. What advice, and you've done this throughout the interview, but is there any other advice you'd like to give beginning writers who are starting to work on their craft career?
Yes. And in fact, if you just bear with me, because this isn't the first time I've answered that question, I've actually started drawing up a little list, a very short list, which I think might be useful. So let's just see. Advice for writers, just to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is a good one. When you start creating new characters, the problem is they might all be the same. And don't worry about that, because even the finest writers, there's a tendency for the characters to get a bit samey, right? But if you want to write really well, you want clearly differentiated characters. And so one way to achieve that is just start writing. Just start writing the characters and see what traits they begin to display. Okay, they might just start to, of their own volition to be slightly different from each other, or see what the story requires of them. Some, the story might require some to be cowards and some to be heroes. And whenever some characteristic crops up in your characters, just start repeating and amplifying those characteristics and make them consistent and reserve them for those particular characters, because that's how you avoid the characters getting similar. We've all done this, is you have two characters behaving in a similar way. Don't do that. Make sure that you stick with one character behaving that way, unless that's the point of your story. So that's one way of beginning to develop very different, colorful, interesting, and differentiated characters. If you have a really great writing team on TV, because they have writing rooms on television, right? Full of talented people. And there's people out there who'll be listening to this who'll be like me, who would be desperate to get into one of those writing rooms. And the way to get into one of those writing rooms isn't really to sort of kind of sweat and strive to be, I want to be the guy in the writing room. I want to be the perfect person for them to hire. You're very unlikely to get hired that way. Like, hire me because I'm so dead and I want to be just the perfect. What they're much more likely to do is hire some nutty maverick writer who shows lots of talent, but is just totally doing their own thing. Because that quite often writing rooms, especially ones for comedies, they just want people who are totally doing their own thing, like way off in their own little universe, but doing a good job in that universe. And then they bring them in and see if they can get them to bring those skills to the show, rather than getting somebody who's like, I want to write for your show so badly. They try and be a brilliant maverick than being a cookie cutter conformist. That's what I'd say. A couple of quotes from famous writers. I think it was J.P. Donlevy who said, writing is turning your worst moments into money. So whenever you're having a really terrible day, I might be able to turn this into a story and make some money out of it. That would cheer you up, and it's good therapy. Similarly, somebody once said, an unhappy childhood is a writer's gold mine. Okay, so that's interesting too. This is a very similar thing. This is very important. Rewriting is always easier than writing. So get something down, whatever it is, get something down, and then it'll be so much easier to rewrite it. So just get something down there. This is one that took me a long time to learn because I was very much a guy who was up in his head rather than down in his heart. I would think and think and think about stuff. Like I would come up with an idea and think, no, that can't be good enough because it came to me right away. And then I'd sort of reanalyze it and twist it around. I've written, always obey your impulse. Whatever the first thing that comes into your head, no matter how crazy it is, take that and explore it. It may not be the way to go, but it might be great. So always obey your impulses. And part of what happens as a result of that is when you start listening to that inner voice, when you start following your intuition, you will get more and better intuition. It just encourages that faculty in yourself. Yes, here's a really practical piece of advice for prose writers. Never use 3 names in one sentence because it just gets confusing. It's too much to follow. So just, break it up into separate sentences or use Jack and Frank were talking about the doctor, not Jack and Frank were talking about Michael. Because nobody was, it's too much for the brain. So never use 3 names in one sentence. This one is a great one for me. It was Louis Buñuel said, the imagination is a muscle. You strengthen it through use. And I'd always thought, like, if I had a great idea, I thought, I'll save that great idea for, a rainy day. Don't use that great idea right away and use it in something, because then you'll have more great ideas. Because seriously, the imagination is a muscle. That was really a turning point for me. John D. MacDonald said, writing is the classic example of learning by doing. So don't sit around thinking that you're going to be a great writer, which I did for years and years and years. The only way to do that is start. And you won't be that great when you start, but you will get better by doing it. Here's a really just practical piece of advice. When I'm writing a novel, so I have a folder for the entire novel open on the screen. And in that, I have a series of Word files. Like I know there's going to be 30 chapters, more or less, in a novel. So I have 30 Word files, and they might just start off being called chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 30. But as soon as possible, I start naming them. And give them names that indicates what's happening in the chapter. Like a dude gets robbed, or bank robbery goes wrong. It is just a quick description of what's happening. And the great thing about that is you begin to see your novel laid out before you on the screen. You can see where there's gaps. It's a bit like what I was saying about the grid, but it's really useful. As you write each chapter, you know what it's about, you know how it fits in with the rest of it, and you also know where you are in the story. So you've got lots of chapters which you've written, but you've also got chapters which are just blank kind of template chapters with titles on them. Sometimes you don't have the titles, but you know that you're going to have chapters with titles. And it's basically a screenwriting trick. Screenwriters have things like they have note cards that they arrange on the wall or virtually on a screen. But it's the same. It's all to do with structure, and it's really helpful. I find it terrifically helpful. More practical advice: when you're sending in your stuff, whether it's a book or a script or whatever, keep your covering letter or your covering email really short. There's a temptation to try and write 3 pages to convince this person to read. Don't. Keep it down. It should be as simple as this. Here is my book, script, whatever. I hope, whatever it is, Gone with the Wind. Here's my book, Gone with the Wind. I hope you like it. That is enough. In fact, they'll be more likely to read it just because you've kept it short and professional than they would be if you wrote something long. The exception is if you've written Gone with the Wind, you could say, I'm a Pulitzer Prize winning Civil War scholar who's written 30 books about the Civil War. That would be useful.
Right.
If you're writing a book about lion taming and you're a lion tamer, that's useful. But other than that, don't bother putting in, don't tell them about your childhood. Don't plaster your thing with copyright notices. We used to have a rule of thumb that the more copyright notices on a piece of writing, the worse it would be. It's always the sign of the rank amateur. The other one really useful piece of advice is names for characters are really important. If you can create an interesting name for a character, you're halfway to creating an interesting character. You really are. I mean, the worse the death of a novel is if somebody's reading it and they don't know who's that character. They can't remember them. And if they've got boring names, they're not likely to remember them. And even if they can't, if you've got a great name, Grimwald, for a character, when that character crops up, even if they can't immediately remember, is that the detective or is it the guy who works in the dry cleaners? They'll still remember the name. And so it won't be like they're coming in cold. So good names for characters, memorable names for characters are really important. And you'll fall in love with your characters sooner and create better characters if you give them good names. That's a long answer to a short question, but those are the bits and pieces of advice that I've sort of made a note of as I think being useful to writers who are starting out.
Before we conclude, is there anything you'd like to add to any of the responses you gave earlier?
I just had a great time chatting with you. It was really fun. Thank you.
I enjoyed myself as well. Thank you so much. And we'll have this out by the holidays, and we'll send you a link, and please feel free to share with everybody you like.
And even people I don't like. Have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
You too as well, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Cheers now. Bye.
Bye-bye.